You are listening to KZSC's Voces, Críticas, Critical Voices. I am your producer and host, Silvana Falcone. Today I'm here with author Tommy Orange, recent graduate from the MFA program at the Institute of American Indian Arts. He is a 2014 McDowell Fellow and a 2016 Writing by Writers Fellow. He's an enrolled member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma. He was born and raised in Oakland, California, and currently lives in Angels Camp, California. I've invited Tommy to the show to discuss his amazing debut novel called They're There. Welcome, Tommy, to KZSC's Critical Voices.
Thank you.
Tommy, could you talk about where you drew the inspiration for this debut novel?
Like you said, I was born and raised in Oakland, California, but I also worked in the urban Indian community in Oakland for almost 10 years in their mental health department at their Native American Health Center. Prior to that, being Native and being from Oakland was just my personal experience and growing up around my dad, and we'd go back to Oklahoma and visit family. But after working in the community and learning a lot about the history of Native people living in Oakland and how far back it went, I just felt there was a story to tell that hadn't been told about Natives living in cities in general, and there weren't very many books about Oakland or novels about Oakland specifically. When I started thinking about actually writing a novel and including aspects of my own life and experience, it just felt natural that I would write something like I did. But I thought of the idea for the whole book first, the premise of a whole bunch of different characters and how their lives converge at a powwow in Oakland. That basic idea just dropped into my head one day, out of nowhere, sort of.
You had mentioned earlier about the lack of representation. Could you talk a little bit about maybe some of the frustrations that surround Native representation when it comes specifically to literature? I
think we're constantly, as Native people in general, constantly battling this idea of us as historical and already gone. When I first started reading, which I came to reading pretty late, I was in my 20s. I hadn't really read hardly anything until I was in my 20s, after I graduated from college, actually. And what I was finding in Native literature were reservation stories and just nothing about cities. And I actually felt kind of isolated by reading anything in the Native canon at first. And I read a lot of books in translation because of it and kind of avoided the Native canon. I think not having anything that feels familiar to you, having nothing about Oakland and nothing about Native people living in cities, I think it just makes you feel like a kind of loneliness and a kind of like maybe an unimportance. It's like growing up Native and not having very many heroes. There's not very many like athletes or celebrities the way there are for other people, and not being represented anywhere just creates a kind of despair and loneliness that I find that literature, when it does make you feel less lonely, is a very powerful experience for me with books in general. And so once I fell in love with fiction and with literature, I felt a tremendous sense of duty.
And so the powwow plays a really significant part of the story. So tell me a little bit about why the powwow, and maybe a little bit about whatever memories you have of your own first powwow and what that experience was like for you.
So we didn't actually grow up going to powwows, but I do have a early memory when I think I must have been like 5. I don't remember very much. It was in Manteca, California, and I remember a lot of dust in my eyes and an orchard that was a relief from the dust, and that's almost about all I remember. And then when I was about 18, my dad took us to one, and a friend that we grew up with was dancing, and I hadn't even known that he danced. It was like at a high school gym in Berkeley. But it wasn't until working in the urban Indian community that I started going to powwows, and I was part of a powwow committee working in Oakland and helped to put on a powwow. A much smaller scale than I imagined in the novel. But powwows, I liked it as a centerpiece for urban Indians because powwows are intertribal, and so is much of the urban Indian population ends up being really intertribal because there's no land base or there's no language base, and a lot of the centers that you see popping up in major cities just ends up being whatever Native people are around all want to get together in the same space. And so there was that, and the sort of loudness, both in color and sound, of Native presence at powwows. It just felt like a strong image for me, a place where Natives look like you would think Natives are supposed to look. There's something that's just like got a lot of complexity to that, and I write about it in the novel, like Indians dressed as Indians, just sort of a commentary on on authenticity and what does it mean to be Indian now. And that's sort of like one of the central themes of the book as well.
I love the different characters that you portray for us in this novel. You have about 12, I think, in total. And what I love about them is that they're layered, they're flawed, they have these struggles, they're on these incredibly complicated and messy journeys. And I wondered, as a writer, how did you maintain clarity about the different journey these characters were going to go on? How did you sort of map out the development of each of these incredibly rich characters?
Part of making them feel distinct was using different point of views, but they also, over time, just took on their own depth. And I wanted to create them as messy and flawed because that's how people are. And a lot of times in literature that I find annoying, often by white men, written by white men, is like they're writers or they're college professors or they're in a certain class that does not represent who I come from. And I just wanted to reflect the complexity and messiness of people that I've known. You know, I didn't use anybody that I've known and build a fictional character from there. They all kind of came out of wherever characters come from. And it gets really messy when you have that many characters, and you really don't want them to lose distinction or blur together because it's already asking a lot for a reader to keep track of 12. So I tried to use point of view, like first, third, and second even, to make a clear distinction. But then also there's something about getting into specificity that is a strange trick that not only does it make them feel so distinct, but there's a universal thing that happens when you get really deep into detail and specificity when it comes to characters. So I tried to find strange things that they would think or were into that would really make them feel distinct, but also I think readers connect to things that are super specific, even though it doesn't seem like you should. There's some kind of weird thing that happens when you get really specific. It feels universal.
For me, you did such an incredible job in getting at the specificity without losing the interconnection. And the one character I kept so eager to get back to was Jackie Redfeather. And I wondered if you could talk specifically about how you imagined her, how this particular character formed in your mind, because her character, for some reason, every time her name was on the chapter, I couldn't wait to read it. There was something about her pain and her journey that I just clicked with. And I wondered if you could talk specifically about her.
There were certain characters that came early, some in the middle, and some at the end. So the Opal chapter where they're on the island, she came in that chapter almost as soon as Opal came. You know, I didn't originally have a chapter for her or Opal's older chapter in mind, but once I decided that I should, the voice just kind of came through in the details. I use a lot of my own personal details for these characters. So being at one of these mental health conferences in Scottsdale, Arizona, that's something that I did. I wasn't struggling with alcohol addiction or anything like that, but a lot of the details were taken from this certain time that I went to this conference. And the more I dug into the details of what it would be like for her, the more she felt fleshed out. You know, for all the characters, there's a mix of imagination and real personal detail that I was sort of fusing together.
You're listening to Tommy Orange, author of the new novel There, about urban Indians based in Oakland, California. He's an enrolled member of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma. He was born and raised in Oakland, California, and currently lives in Angels Camp, California. Let's talk about the title There. And I actually looked up the lyrics to the Radiohead song, and then you had mentioned the Radiohead song in the book. But tell me about, how did you decide on this title? Were there other titles that you were also entertaining in the process?
Dean Oxendine in the book goes before a panel and gets a storytelling grant, and I did the same thing. And I can't remember if I was researching for the actual grant or if I was researching for Dean the character and him researching for the grant in fiction. I was just looking up quotes about Oakland, and there aren't that many, but that one struck me immediately, and the metaphor for Native people, that I could see in it right away. I have a lot of clumsy attempts at that I never want to share with anybody. So There is Gertrude Stein talking about the childhood home she grew up in Oakland. When she came back as an adult, in everybody's autobiography, her book, it's been developed over and no longer recognizable. So its there-ness is, there's no there, is what she's talking about. But the idea that people in Oakland are trying to figure out what it means to be Native now, and there's so much written about Indians in the land, and because there's no representation, there's no way to feel like you belong. And so it has to do with belonging and having Oakland as a home, and trying to make peace with that, and making peace with being Native and whatever that means and all its complexity in present day. the Radiohead song. That was a happy accident when I discovered that I had that album, Hail to the Thief, the Radiohead album, but I'd actually pirated it, and that's sort of what it's referencing, Hail to the Thief. And because I pirated it, the version I had didn't have song titles, so I only knew that album as like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up to 14. I'd known the song, but I didn't know the title, and when I saw the lyrics, I think it was much later after being more deeply involved with the book, and the fact that they ring so true of the book's themes was just a really kind of a funny, serendipitous thing.
I love that because it just means the title there was meant to be.
Yeah, I think so. I think when you get involved with a novel, there's all sorts of strange things that happen.
When did you know that you wanted to become a writer? And maybe who are, if you have any role models or inspirations in the literary world that you also look to as you, I'm assuming, are going to be writing your next book and future books?
I wasn't a writer growing up. I wasn't a very good student either. I did not feel engaged at school, and I was very much into roller hockey. Started playing on the street at the time when there was a professional team in Oakland that played at the Coliseum. Roller hockey had a brief but bright existence in California specifically. It seemed like it was going to become a professional sport, and then the sport died on a beach in Southern California at the end of the 90s. And as it died, because I had hopes of doing something with it, I got into other things and brought the same discipline from playing hockey to music first. I played guitar and piano, and then I got into music school. I got a degree in sound engineering, and it was the summer after that, after realizing there were no good job prospects with that degree, I got a job at a used bookstore and was just sort of reading books, looking for meaning in my 20s, just floundering sort of. And it was there at that bookstore that didn't get visited very often, and I was mainly just reading while I was at work. That's where I fell in love with fiction. Kafka and Borges were really big for me at the beginning because they were kind of the bridge between philosophy and fiction. And then I got into a lot of South American writers and Russians. And like I said, I wasn't reading the native canon at first because it didn't connect to me as some of these other people. For a while, I was very much inspired by Roberto Bolaño, read all of his work, and Murakami, Dennis Johnson, Clarice Lispector, she's a Brazilian writer, has been really important for me. Sylvia Plath, The Bell Jar as a novel, and John Kennedy Toole's Confederacy of Dunces were really big in showing me what a novel could do. So I think in forms of medium, I knew I wanted to write a novel one day, but when I first started reading and then writing, that was in about 2004, and it wasn't until 2011 that I actually started writing there. So I was doing a lot of experimental fiction and wasn't necessarily including personal details, just sort of writing and putting in the work because I knew how far behind I was, just trying to write as much as I could to kind of develop those muscles and bringing over the skills I'd learned, the discipline skills I'd learned from hockey and also music, where if you put in the hours, you can see results. Just believing that to be true, I brought the sense of discipline and results to writing.
So you said you started writing the book in 2011?
Uh-huh.
So it took you about 5 years to write the book then?
It was about 6 years.
6 years.
6 years total.
That kind of commitment, and it's difficult sometimes to sustain, I think, to have that kind of energy to keep writing and to keep persevering and knowing that at some point there will be this result.
It is, and in the middle, it's really hard to remain convinced that it's worth continuing on, especially with this novel. It was really complicated to make it all feel like it was tied together. So luckily I was able to push through.
One of the themes in your book is this reckoning, if you will, with pain and with trauma and historical violence. You, throughout the novel, make references to genocidal Native history, colonial history. I wondered why it was important for you to be sure to foreground that history in order to tell this contemporary story about urban Native life.
There's this sense that Americans have conveniently to get over it in regards to history actually affecting present-day lives, but anybody who doesn't have to look at history in a pretty serious way because of the way they can see it play out in their own lives probably is privileged or comes from a dark history of taking. And so I wanted to make it really clear at the beginning of the novel to foreground, like you said, these characters' lives. I also grew up, one of the only stories we grew up hearing more than once was a massacre story, and that's the Sand Creek Massacre. And our relative barely survived that day, and there's a story from that day how my dad got his name. So he was telling us because it was the origin of his name, and also because I think there's a sense of it's important in a weird way to honor those who were lost and how we survived by telling the story, even though it's horrific sounding and maybe depressing to think about for some people. We still celebrate Thanksgiving based on a lie. With that kind of collective consciousness that the American consciousness, what it is now, I wanted to take to task the idea that I could talk about the beginning of American history and bring it all the way to what an urban Indian is. I feel like to even understand what the context that an urban Indian is embedded in, I felt like I had to go back and draw up a lot.
You still on your book tour?
No, it just ended. I had an event in Copenhagen, Denmark, and the book's already been translated there, and there was a packed house of people at the bookstore that I did a reading at. That was pretty much my last thing.
That's amazing. And so you can see already your novel is having this international significance. And so I want to thank you so much. Congratulations, Tommy, on your first novel. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope people read the book. Congratulations on such a wonderful book.
Thank you. I appreciate that.